Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Glenn Hubbard, my colleague Tano Santos as well. You may have heard there's a big election coming, and the Hub at Columbia Business School has an initiative that we're both engaged in on the future of capitalism. And we thought one way to talk about the election and the future of capitalism is also to bring the past in a little bit too. The two of us together teach a class called Modern Political Economy. It'll be a January block week if you're interested, where we try to capture the big political economy themes affecting business today, and none of them turns out to be new. They all have historical antecedents. It'll probably come up in our conversation today. If you're interested in the Hub generally, the Student Advisory Board is taking applications. Go on the Hub website if that turns you on, because it's really a fascinating environment. In modern political economy, we talk about something called a political economy moment. And by a political economy moment, we mean something snaps in society. It breaks. And what was held to be universally true is no longer. This goes all the way back in capitalism to thinking about Adam Smith's arrival on the stage and attacking mercantilism, the view of his day. By the way, that same debate's happening today. We'll probably talk about it during our time together. But something has happened recently. You can probably tell looking at this election, there's some cross currents that don't look typical. They don't look like what business people might have thought was coming. So Tano, how did we get here?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much all for coming. I mean, it's a very interesting political economy moment, obviously. We remain as polarized as we have been for the last few years. This election is no exception. And I think the factors that are behind this polarization remain what they were when President Trump went down the escalators about a decade ago, and that have been operational for longer than that, which is that the US economy, but not only the US economy, the economy of many advanced nations, is subject to two fundamental permanent shocks. They're not going to go away, and they require political decisions to be handled. So the first one is the one that we talk often, and that I think we're going to talk quite a bit about it, which is the issue of international competition, globalization, international trade, all those issues that we know have affected industrial production in the United States, for instance, that we're not as good as competitors offshore in producing X, Y, and Z. Okay, so that's a first shock that is not going to go away. Is a fact that we need to contend with. More importantly, perhaps, is the second shock, which is we're about to face a second onslaught associated with this, which is automation and technology. So these are two permanent shocks that are taking place, and that, think about these shocks are changing economic relations in our society, and that requires policy responses. Now, what is the policy response that we have in the West typically to handle these shocks? Well, we typically absorb these shocks via the welfare state. Okay, so the welfare state that we start creating in the Great Depression, that after the Second World War becomes part of the social compact in order to stabilize our societies, is designed for a particular class of shocks. And these shocks are not the ones we're experiencing today. So the welfare state, as we discussed in class, you and I at length, is kind of the child of the Keynesian imagination to absorb cyclical shocks. But cyclical shocks, by definition, come and go. These shocks are here to stay. And as a result, because we need to reform this fundamental institution that is the core institution of the modern state, well, when you want to reform the state, you politicize society, because in that reform, there are going to be winners and losers. And of course, the losers will fight the reform of those institutions from which they derive particular rents. If you want to follow, we're talking about a political economy moment. You want to follow a wonderful political economy moment, just track down the strike of the port workers, okay, which started, I think, on Tuesday, of the Eastern Seaboard as well as in the Gulf ports. And it's all about, of course, wages, but also automation. They want to have, I think I wrote the language somewhere, I think I have it here because I wanted to share it with you. They want airtight language that the ports will introduce automation or semi-automation in moving, these big containers around in the port so that they can be offloaded and unloaded in ships and so on and so forth. So the permanence of this shock still there with us, and the politics that comes with absorbing these shocks.
Yeah, if I could jump on this, it's I think the two forces Tano identified are exactly the right ones, and they interact. I mean, the port strike is an example, but also the fascination now with the steel industry. What really harmed the steel industry in the United States was less international competition and more changes in the technology for steel production that U.S. firms were a bit behind on. These two forces moved first very slowly and then quickly. They're very persistent. As Tano said, they're not going away. It's not about the business cycle. And in a political system like the United States, they also have geographic differences in their impact. And the way we elect presidents, the way we elect the Congress, the magnification of those effects in politics are very large. And we're seeing those arguments really written out on the stage. Capitalism's had to reinvent itself before. In the earliest days, not long after Adam Smith comes on the scene, we have a fight between farmers and manufacturers over the future of capitalism. The Great Depression around the world almost killed capitalism. The rise of the modern welfare state comes out of that. We're at another one of those political economy moments where there's an uneasy sense of populism on both sides. But these are definitely the two forces to watch.
So then can I ask you then, Glenn, so where were we coming from in terms of kind of the overarching philosophy that was organizing policy, society, the visions? You and I grew up as economists in the neoliberal age, and we're carrying members of, the neoliberal economy's outlook on the world. What happened? What went wrong? You were there, actually, both in policy and intellectually. So,
well, just to set the stage on neoliberalism, neoliberalism really came to fore in the middle of the last century as a reaction to a perception by economists, by business people, that capitalism had gotten a little bit sloppy. Inefficient corporations, public policies off kilter, and two economists in particular, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, both of whom are Nobel Prize winners in economics, came in and said, you know what, the classical liberal ideas, going all the way back to Smith, let's put them on steroids. Let's take the guardrails off and let's let the economy rip. Now, neoliberalism had huge changes in the economy and also in politics. People point to Ronald Reagan's fascination in this country with neoliberal ideas, but Margaret Thatcher as well. Going to the other side of the aisle, Bill Clinton in the United States was probably more neoliberal even than Ronald Reagan, and Tony Blair compared to Margaret Thatcher. So these ideas were so big they captured everything. Now what happened? Why is it that we're in this political economy moment? The neoliberal ideas did improve growth on average, but we don't all live on average. We live in our own particular seats. Some people did incredibly well as a result of these ideas, others less so, and actually predictably well and predictably less so. And so I think what happened with neoliberalism is a little bit like the debate a long, long time ago over the classical gold standard. Whenever you have an economic system that prioritizes rules of the game over actual people, a political disaster is looming. And that's what happened here. So the fact that these larger and larger number of people are affected by sort of capitalism letting it rip, I think brings the question to a fore. But what do you think?
Yeah, so I would add one thing about the neoliberal era that is kind of interesting, that I always thought is what introduced the political economy moments that we're living through. So you guys are very young and you didn't live through this, but one of the characteristics of the neoliberal era is that you believe many of our social problems had technical solutions. So I always think that the neoliberal era is when economists reign supreme, right? I mean, we were in high demand to give our opinion about everything, and God knows that we're happy to provide our opinion on anything you ask us, okay?
Confidently, if not correctly.
Exactly. We'll have plenty of confidence and, and I think the issue with that in the neoliberal era is that you provided technical answers. The economists do indeed have answers to some major economic problems. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about tariffs at some point that are well understood. We've thought about them for hundreds of years, literally. We have a lot of empirical evidence and so on and so forth. Now, when you implement those policies that have a technical foundation, well, they become political too, because at some point they will have consequences in how income and rent is distributed in society as a result of that policy implementation. And I think one of the problems of that era, Glenn, is that we, in a way, political economy has always been the poor sister in the economics profession, and it turned out to be absolutely essential to understand how the social political environment was going to evolve, given the type of policies that were putting in place, say, in the 1990s, with, in particular, in what concerned trade liberalization. So it's that, and that's, you see it everywhere, by the way, in the political speech. So this idea that experts are not to be trusted, where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from, you told us that if we did what this expert told us to do, everything will be fine. And now I used to have a job in a coal mine in West Virginia that I no longer have. And this doesn't work out the way I thought it was going to work out, given that you were giving me an expert opinion of what a wonderful thing was going to do all this type of, whatever, tariff policies, subsidies, whatever the policy was. Okay, so that's one aspect. That's one aspect of this.
Yeah, I mean, a real aspect of this that we'll have to wrestle together this afternoon is sort of what's next. You know, if the neoliberal consensus breaks down, what follows it for business and for politics? In class, you know, we talk about attention. I wrote a book about this a year or so ago called Walls and Bridges. And it makes a fantastic Christmas present, by the way, if you're looking for gifts to buy people. So basically, the breakdown of neoliberalism means two political responses. One is, let me go back and tell you I can make everything right again. That's a wall. Whatever you don't like, I'll build a wall around it. You don't like foreigners, I'll make them go away. You don't like trade, I'll make that go away. Another approach is to go back to classical liberalism and say, well, how can we help everybody, not just a few, but everybody do well in the economy that actually is, as opposed to the economy that was. We'll come back to this, but whoever, as a politician or as a business leader, successfully mines that idea probably wins the prize. But Tano, I want to take us now to the election and the campaign that's happening. No, and we're not going to, reprise Walls and Vance up here. But what I'd like to do is ask you, are there policies, as you look at it, both sides that are serving up, that have caught your eye from some of these political economy themes?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to mention something that perhaps is a little bit off the beaten track on this, because it caught my eye, and I think we should talk a little bit more about it in our class on political economy, even though we have a table about this. So one of the things that is striking is the emphasis on housing policies. I think it's kind of finally, the time has come to talk about the crisis in affordable housing that we have, not only in the United States, by the way. If you think the United States is bad, you have to look at the United Kingdom and other countries around the world. And it's a problem that, right now we don't have affordable housing. And this is a fundamental political economy problem. It's perhaps, in my opinion, one of the most critical political economy problems in developed societies, which is, once I have a nice big house in a suburb of whatever, Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, whatever the city may be, I don't want anyone else to build a house next to me, okay? Because there will be more housing supply, the house is my vehicle for wealth accumulation, I don't know who's going to be moving next to me, maybe someone I don't like. All those things, all that political economy induces in turn, when everybody behaves that way, a crisis of affordable housing. And this is one place, by the way, where we have a beautiful table in the, and Glenn and I have had this table, I think from the first time we talked together, where we put how much people spend on food, clothing, and housing in 1900, and how much they're spending in food, clothing, and housing today. Okay, so if you look at 1900, average household in the United States, think about it, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, okay? And the rest is entertainment, other things, okay? So 1/3 food, 1/3 clothing, 1/3 housing. You look at it today, you guys are spending about less than 10% in food, less than 10% in clothing.
It's a free lunch today.
Yeah, it's a
So
free
less
lunch.
than
Just think about it, by the way, that we are able to give you free lunch and that is not a big deal for anyone. This is how much we've improved in the way of giving calories to people these days. But if you look at the percentage of disposable income that is still dedicated to housing, it's still 1/3. Okay? And by the way, there's a lot of variation there. For many of our fellow citizens, it's a much bigger percentage of disposable income, and this creates an enormous amount of anxiety. This has come up in the election, and there are two ways you can think about it. You can tackle directly the political economy problem. We don't have the time to deal with that at length. But you can kind of subsidize production. That's a good idea. Subsidize construction. There's a problem of supply. Or the very bad idea, which is to give subsidies to people to buy houses, which would only increase demand and increase prices further. Okay? So that debate is about to get going. President Trump had this idea with his usual political nose that we should be creating big cities. That's kind of an interesting, it's not going to happen, but it's an interesting thought, right? That the way to solve this problem, it's almost like the thought of a real estate developer, right? All these political economy problems, these zoning restrictions, I'm going to build an entirely new city, okay? And again, he has this unique ability of capturing something that is in the air, not articulating the policy very precisely, but it's an interesting thing that caught my eye. What about you?
Well, there's several things. One, next year, whoever wins the presidency, there's going to be a giant tax bill. And the reason for that is a lot of what was passed in 2017 in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act will expire. I raise it because a lot of the political economy themes of who gets what do we tax, what do we encourage, expect that to dominate. It's going to be less of a debate about technical aspects of the tax code and elasticities that economists talk about, and much more on that. Two other areas of interest: fracking. So fracking has drawn an interesting political economy connection between concern about workers in particular industries and also environmental concerns. Coal jobs, say 10 years ago, would have been in that same category. Another is a debate that is playing out right now in the election and will play out over electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are part of a cleaner energy strategy. They are viewed as very future and forward-looking. One of the great fortunes of our day of Elon Musk is built on that industry. That said, EVs are considerably less labor-intensive in their construction, a fact not lost on auto workers in Michigan. So when you were talking about the port strike before, that's small compared to the battle that could be coming over EVs. So I think all this stuff is likely to be in the current.
In the current mix. The other thing is, there are like the small moments in every single campaign. I love the fight for the tax break on tips.
Oh, that's so good.
I love it.
Personally, because I'm getting older, the idea of not taxing Social Security benefits, that appeals.
But the tips is just to get the Nevada votes, obviously, which is, I don't know if it's on play or not, but it's playing for a particular state. And very soon, we're all going to get paid via tips if we actually take the taxes on tips right away. We'll find ways of tipping. You're going to tip us at the end of each class, okay?
Well, I'll tell you what I
wondered. We won't pay taxes.
What I wondered is is carried interest in private equity, is that like a tip?
Yeah.
One's mind can expand when the tax code gets crazy.
Yeah. The other thing, by the way, that is another big topic, is the issue of immigration, right? That it always comes and that creates these cross currents that are always, that's where populism, it really is important sometimes, this immigration. There's a long tradition. It's not unique to the United States, but that's the other theme that we're going to be litigating for years to come. It connects with housing, by the way, and that's why I bring it up, because as we know, immigrants also supply, for instance, a lot of the labor force for the construction sector. So that's one channel through which immigration can help relieve a fundamental problem in our society today. So we need to talk about tariffs, Glenn. And I know you love this topic. So remind us of the basics of tariffs.
Well, I can look at all of you and tell that your favorite subject in college was Econ 101. Obviously, who wouldn't think that? And probably your Econ 101 professor looked you in the eye and said that free trade is a good thing, and he or she would have been correct if said that. But probably they also said that free trade doesn't necessarily make everybody in a society better off, but because it generates gains, those of us who gain can compensate people who lose. And then the professor probably closed his or her books and went on. We're living through this debate not because trade wasn't good. It actually did generate enormous benefits, not only the ones that are obvious to you, like lower consumer prices, but also disciplining competition, improvements in productivity, all good stuff. But is it true that those of us who gained a lot from trade, and I'm looking at you because that's you, it's us. I mean, we are the unambiguous winners of this. Were we necessarily giving a fair shake to everybody else? That's the political question. Unfortunately, because we didn't spend a lot of time in public policy on that question, we're now spending a throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of question of should we have high tariffs? Now, economists will say, look, if you have tariffs, the American public will bear the burden. We've had recent studies, in fact, the two best ones were produced here at Columbia, that when we had China tariffs imposed in the last administration, more than 100% of the burden of the tax was borne by Americans, and yet we still talk about this as being good economic policy. To me, going back to Tano's, I think, very correct point about technocrats, we're not going to do any good as economists if we just wag our fingers at politicians and tell them that tariffs aren't a good idea. Rather, we need to come up with something that scratches the itch in a different way. What can we be doing to prepare people for success? And we once did this at a grand scale. In the 19th century, land-grant colleges were supposed to move young men and women out of agriculture into manufacturing. The GI Bill was moving people into more service-oriented jobs. We once knew how to do this. We got to do that again if we want to fight tariffs. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so, tariffs, like the knee-jerk reaction of an economist, right? When you talk about tariffs, bad idea. It just destroys wealth, it prevents competition, it slows down productivity, it destroys gains from both sides of the equation. So I think there's one argument, though, that you can make, and that is being made actively both in the States and in Europe, and it's the argument of knowledge, that there are some things that you really want to keep at home because you think you need those capabilities for many reasons, either because it has powerful externalities in terms of the knowledge creation that it will provide society, because there are some security issues that you're worried about should we depend on a third party for the provision of this or that technology. So there are arguments that can be made as to why you want to have, be tactical about this. Now, having across the board tariff on everything, why would you want to impose a tariff on coffee? The United States doesn't produce coffee and we're all addicted to coffee. So let's not impose a tariff on coffee. We're not going to start growing coffee in the United States. So, we should be intelligent about it and be very careful about this policy tool. And perhaps there's a way, Glenn, to have that conversation with some politicians. So a lot of the tariffs, by the way, that you're seeing today, so for instance in EVs, President Biden, I think it's 100% tariffs on EVs, right? And in Europe, we've imposed these tariffs that are a little bit more lower levels and more nuanced, are there to correct the type of subsidies many Chinese EV companies, for instance, are receiving from their government, okay? And by the way, you can read the annual report of BYD. It's not that they're trying to hide it. It's there. They tell you how much they got directly in subsidies. So that's a way of leveling the playing field that is perfectly appropriate. I think if I can add on a gloomy note, it's amazing what is left of WTO. It's truly remarkable. Nothing. Really. It's just remarkable.
World Trade Organization.
The World Trade Organization, which was the key institution of the neoliberal age. To go back to
one aspect of this that's particularly interesting, apropos of the election, is how bipartisan these ideas are. Yeah. The candidates are far more similar than they are different on some of these political economy themes. They may use different words or different examples, and the reason for that, I think, is clear. The political economy zeitgeist has shifted. One of these political economy moments when something breaks, it's not surprising that politicians, whatever party they are, get on board. There's another version of that, Tano, in industrial policy. For years, economists were very suspicious of industrial policies, interventions in markets, but it's back. And it's not one party's ideas. Both parties in their campaigns are campaigning heavily on industrial policy. They just call it different things. What's up?
What a comeback, huh?
Yeah.
The industrial policy. I mean, who would have said that we're talking, I mean, it feels increasingly like the 70s now. I mean, if I'm going to put my European Union hat, because I'm going to recommend, even for those of you who are not from Europe, to read the short version of the Draghi report, okay? Because it's basically industrial policy, I think you and I would agree, by another Kakarin member of the neoliberal age like Mario Draghi, okay? And what is interesting is the angle that he takes on this, which is all about innovation. The idea that Europe is falling behind the United States and China, that we're not producing great tech companies the way the United States and China are producing great tech companies, whether it be Google or whatever, Tencent and Alipay and all those great companies that have been put together these days in the United States and in China, but not in the European Union. The question is why? Why is it that we don't have this type of innovation capabilities? And I recommend this to the Europeans in the audience. This, when you will read the report, you will say, yeah, of course, this doesn't work. We're painfully aware of some of the problems that we have when it comes to the economies of scale of funding R&D in Europe. And I will give you a very interesting example in a moment, okay? And the need to actually pool resources more effectively. So what is one thing? Let me give you an example. What is one thing that we don't have in Europe? Well, we don't have a single military policy. So there's no joint military procurement. Well, China and the United States have vast military procurement contracts in order to incentivize technology, in order to produce these wonderful weapons that both the United States, above all, and China have. But in Europe, we don't have that. We don't have an army. We don't have military procurement. So all that powerful source of R&D is completely missing from the European landscape. So there's a wonderful project that I think we should discuss in the political economy class, which is something that has an incredible name, like the Important Projects Initiative of the European Union. It's like a name that can only be concocted in Brussels, okay? And they basically give funds to develop particular projects, okay? And there's and you can apply, your member nations can apply. There's one devoted to technology improvements in the cloud, okay? Sounds good, okay? We should get into the cloud business. The grant is, listen to this, 1.2 billion euros. The R&D budget of, let's not talk about Google or Amazon or Microsoft. Let's talk about Adobe, which is in the business of producing, software to manipulate images and things like that. It's about 3.5 billion euros. So that tells you the magnitude that is needed here to basically bridge that gap. That policy, by the way, of industrial policy, if it's targeted, so think about Airbus. Airbus is a great industrial policy project. Why did it work as well as it did? Well, because it was very focused. You say, I want to build a commercial airplane that is going to compete with Boeing. And all of a sudden, all the incentives get aligned. You have to pass a market test. It has a lot of externalities. Those type of projects may work in building capabilities. Broad industrial policy like we should be working on the cloud, that's going to be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, can I pick up on that? Because I think where economists can contribute to this debate is, again, not by finger wagging, but saying, okay, tell us what you want to do. So one example is to, rather than the blunderbuss that is being suggested by both sides in the US election, what if you just say, let's do something specific? So you mentioned Airbus. Another example in recent history was something like Operation Warp Speed, to develop a vaccine, neutral as to who's doing it, government is providing a market. That industrial policy, if you want to call it that, worked very effectively. Another is to go higher and say, rather than writing checks to Intel and other firms, why don't we spend a ton of money on basic research, to Tano's point, money that would dwarf what the private sector is able to do. with that basic research then spilling over. Hardly an academic idea. We did this. The investments in the military in the Second World War, in the space program, 1960s, 1970s, spilled over into many of the technologies we have today. So there are ways to do this that don't involve the corporatist thinking that we're seeing today. One last big area I wanted to turn to before we kind of open it up for questions is a huge elephant in the room, Tano. It's technology. Yeah. So what are the big themes in technology you think are going to color the campaign?
Well, I don't think I'm not sure the campaign is nuanced enough, but look, we are in the midst of this massive technological revolution. We don't know where it's going to take us. There's a lot of research going on. There's an enormous amount of papers being produced as we speak across all disciplines in the social science, sociology, economics, you name it, on what the artificial intelligence revolution is going to do. I'm just going to mention one thing, and then I'm interested in your thoughts, Glenn. So if you think about automation over the last 40 years, right, the thing is that it really changed the way we do manufacturing. I don't know how many cars GM is producing today, many times over compared to the 1970s, and it's doing it with 1/4 of the workforce that they were doing it 40 years ago, okay? So, and that's all because we have these robots, these wonderful machines doing most of the work, most of the heavy lifting when making these cars. I wonder whether this wave of automation that we're going to be experiencing going forward with artificial intelligence is going to start doing away with service jobs, effectively. We're going to have general practitioners that are artificial intelligent bots, okay, that are going to be able to diagnose what you have and direct you to the right specialist. We're going to have, obviously, artificial intelligence that can do accounting, things that can be codified very easily, and so on and so forth. And I kind of wonder what is going to happen to some of these. One of my favorite examples is marketing and art creation. Who would have said that we would have, particular pieces of technology that can produce wonderful images, wonderful songs, wonderful movies, and so on and so forth. Things that we thought require that human touch, that human domain. All of a sudden, they are subject to automation as well.
Well, as long as they can't teach economics classes.
Yeah, that's the only thing that we care about. So there will be no AI business school professor.
Well, neither of us knows exactly how fast this will happen. And in the economics profession, by the way, there's a big debate over whether AI is going to move quickly and lead to a lot of job displacement. Historically, most technologies, by the way, have net increased, not decreased jobs. Not necessarily the same jobs, but jobs writ large. We don't know that for AI. What we do know is a theme in the election is the anxiety in the public. Because the potential disruption from artificial intelligence, at least generative AI and machine learning, is such that you're not just talking about the kinds of blue-collar jobs that you talked when we began with in globalization and early technological advance. You're talking about young lawyers, architects, some aspects of healthcare and medical services, and universities. All of these things are going to be disrupted. So the anxiety is off the charts. Again, how do you respond to that anxiety in the political process? Well, one of two ways. You either say, well, let me slow it down and throw sand in the gears, which doesn't sound like a very good idea for future growth, or figure out, well, how are we going to change the world to help people be prepared for that? I suspect that the real political and political economy gold in all of this is for a leader who stands up and says, I have that new GI Bill, that new land-grant college, that new big idea, and here it is to prepare people. Unfortunately, we're not seeing any of that, not just in the US, but in any of the elections we're seeing around the world. I don't know if you have a thought on that. We'll
yeah, actually, no, I like very much these. I mean, one of the things that seems wanting, right, these days in our political discourse, in both sides of the Atlantic, frankly, is precisely that lack of grand vision. And I think it has to do with the fact is, the image that I have is this thing of the driving wheels, right, that you put in the back when a kid is learning how to bike. That we've been biking with government assistance, and you're going to tell people, no, you have to adapt and you have to start learning biking on your own. You're going to fall from time to time, but I will be there to help you get up, and so on and so forth. And I think right now we're in that moment where we need to do certain things and take a little bit of a gamble and a risk, and clearly the political atmosphere is not well suited for that type of experimentation when it comes to policy. We'll see.
We're going to do a quick lightning round at the end, but let's open it up first to you. Any questions or thoughts on your mind? There are mics that'll come to you. You can call them.
Yeah, over there, so in the middle, and let's, with a very noticeable purple shirt. Anyone has a mic already? Oh.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay. I just had like a question about I think you mentioned about the tariffs. About generally they're like on average not good, but it kind of in the case of, let's say, you're like offsetting subsidies by government for like electric vehicles or whatnot. So just to go a little bit deeper, do you think like those are fine, or is there like still not great, or is it like a better or more efficient way to kind of combat those?
I mean, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, had a mechanism to investigate these issues, which was organized. It had judges that would see the case, that would mandate access to uncover where those subsidies were hidden. Is that mechanism is completely broken, and the political economy of that is absolutely fascinating, by the way. The WTO and the institutions of the WTO, like the courts that we had in place in order to do the investigation in a neutral way about whether a country, a member nation, was illegally subsidizing, are broken for a reason. It's because we want them broken. And we're going to fall into these bilateral negotiations by which, I'm going to ask, by the way, if you want to read a little bit about this, the way the EU went about figuring out the level of the subsidies that Chinese EV companies were receiving from the government there. They just went directly to the companies, and the Chinese government says, look, we want to figure this one out, otherwise we're going to impose very punitive tariffs. And some of the companies comply and facilitated the data, some others did not, and they got very different tariffs as a result. Now, if you look at, I think BYD is 38%, okay, of tariffs. Now, at those rates, we're going to get a lot of BYD cars in Europe, and then we'll see whether there's something else in addition to the subsidies that we will want to do, like protecting automobile industry employment in Europe and in Germany in particular. We'll see about that. But right now, there's no alternative to that, and there's the right thing to do in terms of offsetting subsidies, and the political economy of this just goes in one direction right now.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things to that. One, I think the narrowest example of tariffs that I can think of being a good idea would be true national security questions. If there are particular technologies that are of security importance for the country, obviously they need to be protected. I'm a little more suspicious as the net gets broader, and it strikes me a better policy for the US. I don't think the WTO can be fixed in its present form, but I do think that like-minded countries, by which I mean United States, Canada, the European Union, Japan, Australia, just to name a group, could come together with a new set of understanding and say to others, if you want to play with us, you'll play by these market rules, otherwise you just won't. And I think that's a conversation we have to have. There's also no reason in the United States that we couldn't have done more of the basic research that would have facilitated EVs in the US. So one of the tensions, I mentioned EV versus internal combustion engine earlier. There's also a tension here because, the only hope to have broad adoption of EVs to meet climate goals is to have much lower prices. So we either have to figure that out. We're either going to buy cheap Chinese cars or we're going to figure it out here, but those goals are fundamentally in tension.
Yeah, can I add just one small point, because it's a beautiful political economy story here. The idea that you can form a coalition of countries that are going to agree to particular trade norms and then basically force other countries who want to trade with that bloc to go by certain rules.
Well, Europe does that now.
Europe does that now, but what is interesting is how clever Chinese authorities have been at playing member nations against each other. And this is playing out right now, by the way, with EVs, because they also had lever. They have leverage against, Germany, because Germany exports a lot to China, and they say, well, we can impose, my favorite tariff that is being threatened on European producers is Spanish ham products. Okay, Spain produces an enormous amount of ham products to China. And, in the recent visit by the Spanish Prime Minister to China, they wanted to change his views on tariffs on EVs. And they dropped that it would be, that they're beginning to think that the Spanish ham is actually not that good for Chinese citizens. Wouldn't it be nice if we impose a big tariff? So that this game is dynamic in nature, is strategic. The political economy of this works both ways. There's nothing new under the sun here. And this is not to criticize the Chinese authorities. Everybody plays this game. We're going to see where it ends. But the political economy of this is devilish.
More questions?
No questions. All the way up there, you know, who has the mic? Is any?
Yeah, I think it goes back.
Yeah, whoever has the mic, stand up and speak.
Hello, thank you. Glenn, you mentioned that we would be now at a similar point as the gold standard and with the rules and winners and losers. Can you say more about that and how that informs the current situation?
Sure. I have an article I wrote recently called Markets for the People that tries to compare two kinds of systems. I mean, the gold standard is an example, a rules-first system versus a people's-first system. So the gold standard was a system that said, here are the rules. Gold and currencies are convertible at fixed and immutable exchange rates. And the way that system worked was if you got off balance, people adjusted. Wages would fall, economies would go into recession, whatever it took. The gold standard had enormous political economy problems. We talk about this a bunch in the class. It's an example. So in modern times, when we moved to sort of the Bretton Woods exchange rate system, it was designed to have many more safety valves than the classical gold standard. And currently, I think what political economy is saying now is we need more ways in large industrial democracies to help people adapt, rather than just saying in the neoliberal mindset, here are the rules, adapt. I hate it when economists use words referring to people in a transition as a transition cost. That's just enormously unhelpful. You wonder why politicians think experts are just not credible with the public. It's language like that. So rules first, gold standard, people first would be some of these systems that we've been talking about up here. I don't know if you have a different thought.
By the way, on that point of transition cost, it was Keynes who coined the term technological unemployment. And, brilliant guy, incredibly deep, probably the savior of capitalism in the 1930s with his theories. And he had a blind spot with this, that those issues were going to play a dominant role in the political arena, that those issues of technological shocks were going to be absolutely instrumental. And he had by the way, it's not the first time, what we're going through today, it's not the first time we see it. We saw it in the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution. We've seen this movie many times before. The only thing is that we're seeing now, in an environment of massive democratic participation and massive communication and social media technologies that can help people mobilize. So that's what is different about the political effects of these technological innovations in the political space compared to previous episodes of technological
revolution. In
revolution.
fact, as you say, this is an old debate again. Smith himself thought technology was very good for workers and wages. Marx thought just the opposite. And many of the debates we're having today, you can almost transport from history those ancient characters. Other questions?
So we have a question there.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming and sharing today. I was curious about the U.S. deficit and how that might play into some of the themes or conversations that we've talked about today. For the U.S. deficit.
Yeah.
And I think right now it's the U.S. deficit is like 1.9 trillion. It's come up in the debates. I think it's something that both political pundits and economists are focusing on, but I'm not sure how much of that has penetrated into like the popular conversation around the election. And so just curious how that might go into our theme of the future of capitalism and kind of all of the more specific policy points we've discussed.
It's a fabulous question, and unfortunately you won't hear about it in this campaign. Both of our two major party candidates are running on a platform that would greatly expand the deficit. They're doing so in different ways and for different reasons, but over time, the two political parties used to take turns on who was more focused on the deficit than the other. Unfortunately, neither one seems to be. Will that have an effect? Yes, because over time, the strains we have from our big social insurance programs, particularly for the elderly, Social Security and Medicare, the country's probably going to be spending more on defense going forward, whoever wins the election in November. This question is going to get called. And I think when I spend time with business leaders, your question is the one that's uppermost in their mind. When it gets called, how does it get called? I spend a lot of time in France, and you may know right now there's a question of should there be allegedly temporary taxes on the wealthy and corporations to close the deficits. This is very much a business concern and problem, but I don't know what you think, but I don't think you're going to hear it.
No,
in the
I mean,
campaign.
this is like radioactive. But so let me add a different angle to this and connect it with some of the things that we have discussed. So if you think there's a big debate in the United States about inequality, right? That inequality has increased dramatically over the last 4 decades, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at inequality pre and post transfers, very different, very, very different. And there's I think Phil Graham in the Wall Street Journal has been writing a nice series of articles on should we be thinking about inequality pre or post transfers. And what is interesting about that argument is that, wait, the reason why inequality is so much lower post-transfer is because you're making the welfare state do a lot of the heavy lifting to close that gap. And now think about the political problems that we're having in a world of inequality post-transfers. Imagine if we start touching that, which is going to lead to more inequality, the type of political problems we would have. So this, by the way, politicians understand very well. I think it was the head of the European Union Commission who said, well, we all know what we need to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we do it. And that's exactly the problem. And this is going to be a very difficult circle to square or square to circle. I don't know how to say that, but you know what I mean. But the welfare state is doing an enormous amount of work in precisely bringing this inequality down, precisely to avoid the type of political problems that we don't seem to be avoiding anyway. So it's going to be incredibly challenging. That worries me enormously. So we have more questions. So there's someone right there next to you. Sorry, it's next to the mic. But this person over here in the center.
Thank you so much. So questions sort of around taxes and government, but also business practices. So in this moment of the political economy, also in the context of AI's potential impact on labor and taxable individual income, what do you see as sort of the goal mix for the relative tax contribution from corporate income taxes from business versus from individuals and payroll taxes? And how do you think about neoliberalism's or broader political economics' role in how much less corporations have been contributing over time and kind of the public sentiment that creates?
It's a great question. The 2017 law, the one that I said expired, the part that's not literally expiring is actually business taxes. That law did cut the corporation income tax rate to bring it more in line with OECD average. The political economy of this is very delicate. Of course, ultimately people pay all taxes. So when you say corporations, the incidence, the burden of the corporation tax falls some on capital owners, some on workers through wages, some in terms of prices we all pay. And so it's a complicated question. I think if you ask economists, like if you're just caring about growth, probably we want a low business tax rate. I wouldn't call it corporate, I mean all business, and then higher taxes on consumption or wages. The political economy, of course, has to consider more than that. And when I mentioned you're going to see this debate play out big time next year, you certainly are. Certainly, Vice President Harris has given her thoughts about what she would do with the corporate income tax rate. I'm not persuaded that former President Trump wouldn't raise it as well, even though he's saying the opposite for political economy reasons, not for economic reasons. I don't know if you have a thought.
No, I completely agree. I mean, for an economist, right, these taxes on corporations, exactly what Glenn said. It's people who are paying taxes. And you're introducing a bunch of distortions. I'm very Friedmanite on this, that we probably would want to lower as much as possible taxes on corporations. Politically, it's not feasible, and then have the consumption and taxes on wages as appropriate. But it's not going to happen.
Time for another quick question.
Yeah, another quick question. I don't want to belabor the point. Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here today. I wanted to ask what you think, like how Mexico will play into things in terms of being the biggest trading partner for the United States, and with the context of obviously having imposed tariffs in China, Mexico being, the southern neighbor of the U.S., and have just voted in a woman president who's pretty nationalistic. So I think it's something that's going to play into things, but people are not talking about much, and we'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
It's a hugely important question. Mexico, at least in my view, has an opportunity of a lifetime here. The particular situation between the United States and China, the long-term relationship between the United States and Mexico that goes, the policies going back decades of encouraging collaboration long before NAFTA or USMCA, there were programs to do that. So I think this is an enormous opportunity for Mexico and for American business. That said, there's also the key in politics in Mexico as well as in the United States, judiciary, attitudes toward business. I think there's a hopeful waiting and seeing, but those are real questions in business people's minds. I don't know if you have a thought.
I don't know, this is a big question. I don't know how to think about it. I wish I knew more about it. I was taken aback, frankly, by President López Obrador last actions while in government just right before leaving, and that judicial reform is going to introduce a lot of, I don't know where that is heading and why he did that. But issues of legal certainty are going to play an important role. It's going to be an asset in very short supply. What it was surprising, to Glenn's point, is that the opportunity is unique. Why would you want to introduce legal uncertainty when it's an asset that is in such short supply these days in the world? That's my only take on this.
Just a quick lightning round between the two of us. Which big economic thinker from the past speaks to this election and this zeitgeist today? The best.
The best. I think you and I have the same one. I always recommend people to read Carl Polanyi's work. The Great Transformation is a book that gets rediscovered every 15 years, and for a reason. And it has a very simple message, okay? It's a message that we tend to forget, but that it speaks to the issues that we have discussed here today, which is the market is a phenomenal wealth creation machine, but it destroys many things while creating that wealth, okay? And many of those things are not properly priced by the market. So as the market creates wealth, because we say lower tariffs and we create the global trade environment of the 19th and 2000s, well, you're going to undo communities like Youngstown, Ohio, or you're going to undo communities here and there. And yes, wealth is being created, but something else is being lost, and those things are what are important for people. Eventually they will come back to haunt you politically. And I think he really nails this aspect of political economy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So much of the political debate we're having tends to be, do you want to think of Smith or Hayek or Friedman over here? Do you want to think about Marxian views over here? The real issue in the middle are non-market relationships that bring people together. Polanyi is probably the most important thinker you may not have read or heard of. He's a centerpiece of our class as a result, and I suspect holds the key to this election and what's next. So thanks for spending time with us, and also hopefully we'll see some of you in modern political economy, but definitely stay tuned with this election. So thank you.
Thank you so much.